The sky over the industrial city turned black not from nightfall, but from the sheer density of smoke and ash. On August 23, 1942, the Luftwaffe unleashed a torrent of destruction that would forever scar the banks of the Volga River. Thousands of tons of incendiary bombs rained down upon the wooden structures of the residential districts, turning homes into infernos in mere seconds. The roar of engines and the whistle of falling ordnance drowned out the screams of the civilians trapped below. This was not merely a military engagement, but the opening salvo of an apocalypse that would consume soldiers and citizens alike. The great river itself seemed to catch fire as oil tanks ruptured and spilled their burning contents into the water, creating a terrifying barrier of flame. The stakes could not have been higher for the Soviet Union or for the Third Reich during that sweltering summer. Adolf Hitler had set his eyes on the city that bore the name of his nemesis, Joseph Stalin. Capturing this industrial hub was vital not only for symbolic reasons, but to sever the supply lines transporting oil from the Caucasus to the rest of Russia. If the German Sixth Army succeeded, the Red Army would be starved of fuel, and the Soviet war machine would grind to a halt. The fate of the entire Eastern Front hung in the balance, resting on whether this city could withstand the might of the Wehrmacht. Defeat here meant the likely collapse of the Soviet resistance and a terrifying victory for Nazi Germany. As the German forces approached the city outskirts, the Soviet High Command issued a directive that would define the brutality of the coming months. Order number 227 was read to every soldier on the front lines, carrying the infamous command, "Not one step back." Panic makers and cowards were to be liquidated on the spot to ensure absolute discipline in the face of the enemy. The soldiers of the Red Army understood that retreat was no longer an option, and that they were expected to die fighting rather than yield ground. This decree transformed the defense of the city from a strategic operation into a desperate struggle for survival, where human life became secondary to the soil beneath their boots. General Friedrich Paulus commanded the German Sixth Army, and he was a man of meticulous planning and traditional military doctrine. He observed the city from his forward command post, confident that his superior firepower and armored divisions would crush the Soviet defenders quickly. His tanks had swept across the steppe with terrifying speed, and the Luftwaffe ruled the skies with impunity. Paulus believed that the capture of the city was imminent and that the Soviet forces were on the brink of total collapse. However, he failed to anticipate that the ruins of the city would neutralize his greatest advantages, turning his tanks into steel coffins within the rubble-choked streets. The man tasked with the impossible job of holding the city was Lieutenant General Vasily Chuikov. He took command of the 62nd Army at a moment when the situation seemed hopeless and the Germans were already nearing the Volga. Chuikov was a ruthless and pragmatic leader who understood that traditional tactics would fail against the German war machine. He decided to hug the enemy by keeping his front lines so close to the Germans that the Luftwaffe could not bomb them without hitting their own troops. This strategy forced the Wehrmacht into brutal close-quarters combat, where their technological superiority was rendered useless and the fighting devolved into primitive savagery. The initial German assault was ferocious, as panzer divisions tried to punch through the northern suburbs to reach the river bank. Soviet workers from the tractor factories drove unpainted tanks directly off the assembly lines to meet the invaders in suicidal charges. Militia units comprised of civilians and factory workers fought with Molotov cocktails and old rifles against hardened German infantry. The streets became slaughterhouses where every building and every room was contested with grenades and bayonets. The defenders knew that if the Germans reached the river in force, the city would be cut off from supplies and the battle would be lost. By mid-September, the fighting had moved into the city center, and the railway station changed hands more than a dozen times in a single week. The elegant buildings of the city center were reduced to hollow shells, and the streets were buried under mountains of brick and twisted metal. Snipers from both sides hid in the wreckage, waiting for the slightest movement to claim a victim. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and decaying bodies as the summer heat accelerated decomposition. Water was scarce and food was rationed to the bare minimum, yet the defenders fought on with a tenacity that baffled the German attackers. One of the most critical strategic points in the city, was a burial mound known as Mamiev Kurgan. This high ground offered a commanding view of the entire city, and the Volga River making it the prize that both sides coveted. Thousands of soldiers died on its slopes as waves of infantry charged up the hill into machine gun fire. The soil of Mamiev Kurgan was churned up so thoroughly by artillery shells that it was said more metal existed there than earth. Control of the hill fluctuated daily and sometimes hourly as exhausted troops engaged in vicious hand-to-hand combat in the trenches and bunkers that scarred the landscape. In the heart of the city, a massive concrete grain elevator became a fortress that held out against overwhelming odds. A small garrison of Soviet sailors and infantrymen defended the structure against German tanks and artillery for days. The grain elevator was filled with smoke and dust, and the defenders were cut off from water and ammunition. They fought from floor to floor, dropping grenades down stairwells and firing at anything that moved. The Germans marveled at the resistance, believing a battalion was inside when in reality only a handful of men remained. When the position finally fell, the bodies of the defenders were found surrounded by piles of empty casings. The nature of the combat in the city was unlike anything the German soldiers had experienced in their previous campaigns across Europe. They called it Rattenkrieg or Rat War because they were forced to crawl through sewers and cellars to advance. Kitchens and bedrooms became battlefields where men fought to the death over a single room. The boundaries of the front line were erased, and enemies often slept in adjacent rooms, separated only by a thin wall or a pile of debris. This psychological strain wore down the morale of the German troops, who were used to swift victories in open terrain. Lieutenant General Vasily Chuikov moved his headquarters constantly to avoid being targeted by German bombers and artillery. He lived among his men, sharing their dangers and their meager rations, which earned him their fierce loyalty. Chuikov knew that the key to survival was to make the Germans pay a heavy price for every yard of ground they captured. He organized storm groups equipped with submachine guns and grenades to infiltrate German positions at night. These small units wreaked havoc on the enemy, causing confusion and fear in the darkness. The Soviet strategy was to bleed the German army dry in a war of attrition. As the battle raged on, the Luftwaffe continued to pound the city, reducing it to a lunar landscape of craters and ruins. The Volga River was the only lifeline for the defenders, and the crossing was a perilous journey under constant fire. Flotillas of small boats and barges ferried ammunition and reinforcements across the river at night while evacuating the wounded. Many vessels were sunk by German dive bombers or artillery, leaving the water choked with debris and bodies. The sailors of the Volga flotilla displayed incredible heroism, keeping the supply line open despite the terrifying odds against them. In late September, a sergeant named Yakov Pavlov and a small platoon captured a 4-story apartment building in the city center. This structure, which would become known as Pavlov's house, commanded a strategic view of a large square. The soldiers fortified the building with landmines and machine gun nests, turning it into an impregnable fortress. For 2 months, they held off constant German attacks, destroying tanks with anti-tank rifles from the roof and cellar. The building was marked on German maps as a fortress, and Pavlov and his men became legends for their stubborn defense. The German advance slowed to a crawl as the weather began to turn and the first signs of winter appeared. The days grew shorter and the temperature dropped, making life in the ruins even more miserable for the soldiers. The Germans had not prepared for a winter campaign, believing the war would be over before the snow fell. They lacked warm clothing and winter lubricants for their weapons and vehicles. Frostbite became a major enemy, claiming thousands of casualties on both sides. The harsh Russian winter was arriving to aid the Soviet defenders, just as it had done against Napoleon over a century earlier. While the Germans were fixated on capturing the last few hundred yards of the city, the Soviet High Command was planning a massive counteroffensive. Marshal Georgy Zhukov and General Alexander Vasilovsky devised a plan codenamed Operation Uranus. They identified the weak flanks of the German Sixth Army, which were guarded by poorly equipped Romanian and Italian troops. The plan involved a massive pincer movement that would encircle the German forces in the city and cut off their supply lines. The Soviets secretly amassed over 1 million men and thousands of tanks on the steppes north and south of the city. On the morning of November 19, 1942, the Soviet artillery opened fire with a thunderous barrage that shook the earth. The noise was deafening as thousands of guns pounded the Romanian positions on the northern flank. Through the fog and snow, T-34 tanks surged forward, crushing the barbed wire and overrunning the terrified defenders. The Romanian forces lacked effective anti-tank weapons and were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer weight of the Soviet attack. Panic spread through the Axis lines as the front collapsed, and the Soviet armored columns raced deep into the German rear. The following day, the Soviet forces on the southern flank launched their own attack, smashing through the Romanian Fourth Army. The two pincers of the Soviet offensive moved rapidly towards the town of Kalach, where they were scheduled to meet. The German command was slow to react, believing the attacks were minor local skirmishes rather than a major strategic offensive. By the time Paulus realized the danger, it was too late to stop the momentum of the Red Army. The trap was closing and the hunter was about to become the hunted. On November 23rd, the two Soviet spearheads met at Kalach, completing the encirclement of the German Sixth Army. Nearly 300,000 German and Axis soldiers were trapped in a pocket known as the Kessel. The besiegers had become the besieged, and the situation in the city changed dramatically. The German troops who had been pushing towards the Volga were now cut off from their supply bases and surrounded by a ring of hostile steel. The news of the encirclement sent shockwaves through the German high command, and Hitler was furious. Adolf Hitler refused to allow the Sixth Army to break out of the encirclement despite the pleas of his generals. He ordered Paulus to hold his position and promised that the Luftwaffe would supply the army by air. The head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, assured Hitler that his planes could deliver the necessary tonnage of food and fuel. This promise was a fatal delusion, as the Luftwaffe lacked the transport aircraft and the weather conditions were atrocious. The daily requirements of the Sixth Army were far beyond what the air bridge could provide. Inside the Kessel, the conditions for the German soldiers deteriorated rapidly as supplies dwindled. Rations were cut to starvation levels, and soldiers resorted to eating horses and even rats to survive. The lack of fuel meant that tanks and vehicles were abandoned, and the wounded could not be evacuated. The bitter cold of the Russian winter seeped into the bones of the men who huddled in basements and dugouts without heat. Disease and malnutrition began to take a toll, weakening the army from within, while the Soviets tightened the noose from without. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein was tasked with breaking the encirclement and relieving the Sixth Army in an operation codenamed Winter Storm. His panzer divisions fought their way towards the city through deep snow and fierce Soviet resistance. They managed to get within 30 miles of the pocket, and the soldiers inside could hear the distant rumble of artillery. However, Paulus refused to disobey Hitler's orders and did not attempt to break out to meet the relief force. The Soviet forces launched a counterattack that threatened Manstein's own flanks, forcing him to retreat. With the failure of the relief effort, the fate of the Sixth Army was sealed. The Soviet forces began to squeeze the pocket, pushing the Germans back into the ruins of the city. The airfield at Pitomnik was captured, ending the meager air supply and leaving the wounded with no hope of escape. The German soldiers fought on with the desperation of doomed men, knowing that surrender meant a journey into the unknown horrors of Soviet captivity. The once proud Sixth Army was reduced to a ragged mob of starving and freezing men. The Soviet commanders offered Paulus an opportunity to surrender in early January, promising humane treatment for his men. Paulus contacted Hitler requesting permission to surrender to save the lives of his remaining soldiers. Hitler refused, ordering him to fight to the last man and the last bullet. He promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal, noting that no German Field Marshal had ever been taken alive. The implication was clear: Paulus was expected to commit suicide rather than surrender to the Bolsheviks. The final Soviet assault began on January 10th, splitting the German pocket into two smaller pockets. The fighting was brutal as the Soviets cleared the Germans from the basements and ruins where they had taken shelter. The temperature dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius, and the landscape was littered with frozen corpses. The German resistance began to collapse as units surrendered en masse or simply ceased to fight due to exhaustion. The city that Hitler had wanted to capture at all costs had become the graveyard of his ambitions. On January 31, 1943, Soviet soldiers surrounded the Univermag department store where Paulus had his headquarters. A young Soviet lieutenant entered the basement and found the newly promoted field marshal lying on a bed in a darkened room. Paulus looked like a broken man, his face twitching and his uniform disheveled. He surrendered his pistol and his staff, effectively ending the resistance of the Southern Pocket. It was a moment of immense historical significance as the first German field marshal in history surrendered to the enemy. 2 days later, on February 2nd, the northern pocket of German resistance surrendered and the guns finally fell silent. The Battle of Stalingrad was over, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable devastation. The city was a wasteland of rubble and the streets were paved with the dead. Over 90,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner, including 24 generals. They were marched off into captivity across the snow-covered steppe, a long column of broken men stretching to the horizon. Only 5,000 of them would ever return to Germany alive. The human cost of the battle was staggering, with estimates of total casualties reaching nearly 2 million people. The Red Army had lost over 1 million men in the defense of the city and the subsequent offensive. The Axis forces suffered over 800,000 casualties, including the destruction of the entire 6th Army and several Allied armies. The civilian population of the city had been decimated, with tens of thousands killed in the bombing and the crossfire. It was the bloodiest battle in the history of warfare. The victory at Stalingrad was a turning point of World War II and a psychological blow from which the Third Reich never recovered. The myth of the invincibility of the Wehrmacht was shattered, and the initiative on the Eastern Front passed to the Soviet Union. For the first time, the German people were forced to confront the reality of a major defeat. The morale of the Red Army soared, and the Soviet people began to believe that victory was possible. The road to Berlin had begun on the banks of the Volga. The city began the slow and painful process of rebuilding almost immediately after the battle ended. The citizens who emerged from the cellars and ruins faced the daunting task of clearing the debris and burying the dead. The scars of the battle remained visible for decades, serving as a constant reminder of the sacrifice made by the defenders. The city was eventually renamed Volgograd, but the name Stalingrad would forever be synonymous with heroism and endurance. Monuments were erected to honor the fallen, including the massive statue the motherland calls on Mamiev Kurgan. Vasily Chuikov, the man who had defended the city with such ferocity, went on to lead his army all the way to Berlin. He would be the one to accept the surrender of the Berlin garrison 2 years later, completing a journey that began in the ruins of Stalingrad. His determination and refusal to retreat had saved the city and perhaps the Soviet Union itself. He was later buried on Mamiev Kurgan at his own request to remain with the soldiers he had led. Friedrich Paulus spent years in Soviet captivity before being released and moving to East Germany. He became a vocal critic of the Nazi regime and testified at the Nuremberg trials. He lived out the rest of his days, haunted by the memories of the men he had led to their deaths. His blind obedience to Hitler had cost him his army and his honor. He died in 1957, a broken figure in a divided nation. The battle also had profound geopolitical consequences, signaling the rise of the Soviet Union as a superpower. The Western Allies watched the events at Stalingrad with a mixture of relief and awe, realizing the immense power of the Red Army. The coordination of the Big Three allies improved as they sensed that the tide of the war had turned. The victory strengthened Stalin's hand at the negotiating table and shaped the post-war map of Europe. The world had witnessed the resilience of the Soviet people. Today, the battle is remembered as a testament to the extremes of human endurance and the brutality of total war. It serves as a warning of the consequences of tyranny and aggression. The soldiers who fought there on both sides were victims of ideologies that demanded absolute sacrifice. Their stories are etched into the history of the 20th century, reminding us of the fragility of peace. The silence that now hangs over Mamiev Kurgan is a heavy one filled with the ghosts of the fallen. As we look back on the events of 1942 and 43, we must ask what drove men to fight with such savagery. Was it fear of their commanders' love for their country, or simply the instinct to survive? The answer lies buried in the frozen earth of the steppe and the crumbling brickwork of the city. Stalingrad was not just a battle, it was a crucible that tested the limits of the human spirit. It remains a defining moment in the history of humanity. The legacy of Stalingrad endures in the military academies where the tactics are studied and in the hearts of the Russian people. It is a story of how a city on the edge of annihilation refused to die. The phrase "not one step back" echoes through time as a symbol of ultimate defiance. The world was changed forever on the banks of the Volga River, where the fate of nations was decided in fire and blood. The whisper of time carries the voices of those who perished, ensuring they are never forgotten.